A quiet afternoon at a small park in suburban Seattle. Golden sunlight filters through the trees. Children's laughter fills the air. Daniel Brooks, a 41-year-old single father, sits on a weathered wooden bench, watching his 9-year-old daughter Emma play. Nearby, a woman is kneeling in the grass, gently helping another child tie their shoelaces. She is Clara Hayes, a preschool teacher. Emma watches her for a long time. Suddenly, she walks back and pulls Daniel's hand. "Dad, I want her as my mom." Daniel freezes, not because it's unexpected, but because he isn't ready for the truth behind her question. Watch. Daniel Brooks was a man of steel, silence, and absolute rhythmic routine. At 41, his face was a map of quiet focus and the deep, enduring weariness of a man who worked two lives, one to keep the digital world running as a systems engineer and one to keep a small home safe. For 5 years, Daniel had lived in a world that was perpetually out of balance. His wife, Sarah, had passed away when Emma was just 4 years old, leaving behind a hollow space in their lives that no amount of effort could ever truly fill. The silence in their apartment wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the kind that had echoes. It was the sound of a missing laugh in the kitchen and the phantom scent of lavender perfume that seemed to linger in the hallway long after the bottles were gone. Daniel had become a master of the everything role. He was the father who worked 10-hour days, the mother who learned to braid hair with clumsy, calloused fingers, the friend who played elaborate tea parties on the living room rug, and the guardian who checked under the bed for monsters every single night with a flashlight and a weary smile. He had systematically dismantled his own ambitions. He was once a rising star in a global aerospace firm, but the 60-hour weeks and the international travel were a luxury his heart could no longer afford. He needed to be the person Emma saw when she woke up and the one who tucked her in. He traded the corner office for a local technical consulting role because it bought him the one thing money couldn't: 3:30 p.m. school pickups. But his life was a fortress of managed survival. Daniel believed that if he kept the schedule tight enough, if the pancakes were always made on Saturday and the laundry was always done on Sunday, then the house wouldn't feel so empty. He lived in a safety zone, avoiding anything that could disturb the delicate peace he had built. This meant no dating, no late-night drinks with colleagues, no looking at the women in the grocery store who offered a sympathetic smile. To Daniel, a new relationship wasn't an opportunity for joy. It was a risk of a secondary heartbreak. For him, but mostly for Emma. He was a man who had survived a hurricane and decided that the only way to stay safe was to never leave the harbor again. He often sat at the kitchen table long after Emma went to sleep, staring at his reflection in a cup of cold coffee. He felt like a machine that was running on a low battery warning, but one that could never be plugged in. He thought he was doing a perfect job of hiding the cracks. He thought that as long as the bills were paid and the school lunches were packed, Emma was protected. Emma, however, was growing up with a terrifyingly acute sense of observation. At 9, she was a bright, intuitive child who possessed a kind of quiet wisdom that often caught Daniel off guard. She was his shadow and his most honest mirror. She saw the way her father stared at the empty chair during dinner. She noticed the way his shoulders slumped when he thought she wasn't looking. She understood that while their house was full of toys, books, and love, it was missing a specific kind of frequency. It was missing a warmth that her father's logic and heroics couldn't manufacture. The park was their sanctuary. Every Tuesday and Thursday, they would spend an hour there before heading home. For Daniel, it was a time to breathe and check his emails. For Emma, it was a time to conduct an investigation into a world she couldn't quite remember. She would sit on the swings, moving slowly, watching the other families. She was a scientist of human connection, gathering data on the laughter of mothers and the way couples held hands. Daniel watched her today, his mind occupied by a server migration project, but his eyes never leaving the bright yellow of her jacket. He felt a sense of pride. He had kept her whole. He had kept her happy, or so he told himself every night in the mirror. He didn't realize that Emma had been watching a woman who had been coming to the park for 3 weeks, a woman who didn't arrive with a husband or a frantic schedule, a woman who looked like she carried a piece of the sun in her pocket. The silence of Act 1 is the silence of a man who thinks he has enough. Daniel believed that being everything was a sustainable identity. But as Emma pulled her hand away from the climbing frame and began to walk toward him with a look of intense, sudden purpose, Daniel realized that the walls of his fortress were about to be tested. The missing piece of his family wasn't just a vacancy. It was a silent request that was finally finding its voice through a child who knew her father was drowning in his own strength. Clara Hayes was not an impressive woman in the way the city of Seattle usually defined it. She didn't wear designer power suits or drive a car that demanded attention. She was 27, and she worked as a preschool teacher at a small, community-run center 3 blocks from the park. She was the kind of person who seemed to blend into the scenery until you looked at the way she interacted with the world. Clara possessed a specific kind of magic that was entirely, aggressively natural. When a child fell in the grass, she didn't rush over with a panicked, "Are you okay?" that made them cry harder. She would kneel down, stay perfectly still, and wait for them to look at her. She spoke in a low, grounding voice that seemed to bypass the noise of the playground. She had a way of being present that didn't demand attention. She simply provided a safe place for people to land. Emma had been watching Clara for 3 weeks. She noticed that Clara never checked her watch while she was with a child. She noticed that when Clara laughed, she did it with her whole face, including the tiny wrinkles at the corners of her eyes. But mostly, Emma noticed the way Clara looked at Daniel. It wasn't the pitying look of the other parents, and it wasn't the searching look of a woman looking for a partner. It was a look of quiet, respectful recognition. The look of one silent observer acknowledging another. Daniel had noticed her too. He called her the shoelace lady in his head. Every time they were at the park, she was invariably helping a toddler with a tangled knot or showing a group of kids how to find ladybugs in the bushes. Daniel appreciated her silence. She didn't try to strike up awkward conversations with him. She didn't ask if he was doing okay on his own. She simply existed in the same space, a warm presence that didn't ask for anything in return. To a man who was perpetually exhausted from performing strength for the world, Clara's lack of effort was the most attractive thing about her. One afternoon, a week before the bombshell, Daniel had dropped his coffee cup. It didn't break, but the lid popped off, and the liquid splashed across his shoes. He had let out a frustrated, weary groan, the sound of a man who was tired of even the smallest failures. Clara had been nearby. She didn't offer a lecture on being careful. She didn't try to fix it for him. She simply walked over, handed him a thick stack of napkins she pulled from her bag, and gave him a small, knowing nod before walking back to the sandbox. "You look like you needed a break," she had signed to him with her eyes. Daniel had felt a strange, electric jolt in his chest that day. It wasn't romance in the traditional sense. It was the shock of being seen. He realized then that Clara wasn't just a teacher. She was an architect of atmosphere. She made the park feel safer just by being in it. Emma was watching that interaction from the top of the slide. She saw the way her father's shoulders relaxed when Clara handed him those napkins. She saw the way the tight, permanent lines around his eyes softened for just a second. Emma realized that Clara had a tool that Daniel didn't have in his engineering toolkit. She had the ability to make him breathe. To a 9-year-old girl who had spent 5 years trying to be perfect so her dad wouldn't have to worry, this was a revelation. Emma liked Clara because Clara didn't try to be special. She didn't bring toys to the park to buy the kids' affection. She didn't try to step into their lives or change their rhythm. She was just there, like the sun, like the grass, like a promise that stayed kept. Emma began to wonder what it would be like to have that magic in their house. She imagined the smell of vanilla replacing the smell of floor wax. She imagined a person who could look at her dad and tell him it was okay to be tired. She realized that while her dad was her hero, every hero needs a place to take off their armor. Act 2 was the slow crystallization of a child's hope. Daniel saw a woman who didn't create pressure. Emma saw a woman who could hold her father's weariness. Neither of them realized that they were both looking at the same solution from different angles. Clara remained on the periphery, unaware that she was the center of a silent debate happening on a wooden bench. She was a preschool teacher who was about to be given the most difficult lesson of her life, not by a textbook, but by a little girl who decided that presence was the only requirement for a family. The sun was dipping lower, casting long, liquid shadows across the playground. The air was getting cooler, and the sound of the city was beginning to surge as the evening commute began. Daniel was packing their water bottles into the bag, his mind already calculating the remaining time before bedtime and the emails he still needed to answer. He felt a tug on his sleeve. Emma was standing there, her face a mask of absolute, unshielded seriousness. "Dad?" Her voice was small, but it carried a weight that stopped the surrounding noise. Daniel knelt down, his usual dad mode engaging instantly. "Yeah, pal. You ready to go? Tacos tonight?" Emma shook her head. She pointed toward the grass where Clara was now sitting, reading a book while a group of kids played nearby. "I want her as my mom." The world didn't just stop for Daniel, it evaporated. He felt the air leave his lungs as if he had been hit in the chest with a physical weight. He looked at Clara, then back at Emma, his brain frantically searching for a logic gate to handle this input. He expected a joke. He expected a "can we get a dog" type of request. He didn't expect a 9-year-old to rewrite the structure of their reality in 6 words. "Emma, that's a very big wish," Daniel finally managed to say, his voice sounding thin even to his own ears. He felt a flush of heat in his cheeks, a mixture of embarrassment and a sudden, sharp fear. He was terrified that Clara had heard her. He was terrified that Emma was hurting in a way he hadn't seen. "I know," Emma whispered, her eyes never leaving his. "But I've been thinking about it. For a long time." Daniel pulled her closer, sitting back on the bench, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Why her, Emma? You don't even know her name. We've never even spoken to her properly. You know we're doing okay. Just the 2 of us, right? I'm doing my best to make you happy." Emma looked at her father with a gaze that made him feel like the child and her the adult. She took a deep breath, her small jaw setting in a mirror image of his own determined expression. "Because she looks at you like you're not tired." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. He went deathly silent. He felt a lump form in his throat so large it was hard to swallow. He had spent 5 years trying to hide his exhaustion. He had spent 5 years pretending that he was a machine that didn't need rest, a lighthouse that didn't need a battery. He thought he was doing a perfect job of protecting her from the weight he carried. But Emma had seen right through the armor. She hadn't seen the hero dad. She had seen the tired man who was slowly fading under the pressure of being everything. "When she's near us," Emma continued, her voice gaining a strange, heartbreaking clarity, "you don't check your phone as much. You don't rub your eyes like you're trying to wake up. You just sit there. And I think if she stayed, you could finally take a nap, Dad. A real one." Daniel put his head in his hands. He felt a tear escape and fall onto the wooden slats of the bench. He realized then that he had been so busy being a provider that he had forgotten to be a person. He had been so focused on filling the role of a mother that he had completely ignored the fact that he was a lonely man. Emma wasn't asking for a new mother for herself. She was asking for a partner for him. She was trying to save her father from the cold silence of his own fortress. "I don't know if she wants to be part of our world, Emma," Daniel whispered into his palms. "It's a lot to ask of someone. We're a messy project. We have ghosts in the hallway and burnt pancakes on Saturdays. She has her own life. She has her own dreams." "She already is part of it," Emma argued softly, leaning against his shoulder. "She's the one who gave you the napkins. She's the one who smiled at me when I fell on the slide. She's already here, Dad. You're just the only one who keeps looking the other way because you're afraid of being happy." Daniel looked up. He saw Clara across the park. She had closed her book and was looking toward them. She didn't look away when their eyes met. She didn't offer a flirtatious smile. She just gave a slow, respectful nod, a silent acknowledgement of the heavy moment she could clearly sense from across the grass. Daniel realized then that he couldn't keep running. He couldn't keep Emma's wish locked in the maybe file. He had to face the reality that the dad server was reaching its limit. He had to decide if he was brave enough to let someone see the man who was tired. He looked at Emma, who was waiting for his decision with the same intensity he used for a technical audit. "All right, pal," Daniel said, wiping his face with his sleeve. "I'll talk to her, but no promises, okay? We move slow. Remember the rule? Keep your eyes on the instruments, not the noise." Emma grinned, a wide, radiant expression that made the last 5 years of double shifts feel like nothing. "I know the instruments are good, Dad. I checked them myself. They're pointing right at her." The walk toward Clara was the longest distance Daniel had ever traveled on foot. Each step felt like he was leaving the safety of his harbor and sailing directly into a storm he wasn't prepared for. But as he neared the woman in the wool coat, he realized the air around her wasn't turbulent at all. It was the first time in 5 years that the wind felt like it was finally behind him, pushing him toward a shore he had forgotten existed. Daniel stopped a few feet from where Clara was sitting. The adrenaline was starting to fade, replaced by a raw, jagged vulnerability. He felt like he was standing in front of a mirror he didn't want to look into. "My daughter said something today," Daniel began, his voice raspy and uncertain. He didn't lead with a joke or a professional greeting. He went straight for the truth, his hands shoved deep into his pockets to hide the shaking. Clara stood up slowly, tucking her book into her bag. She didn't look surprised. She looked like she had been waiting for this conversation for a long time. "I have a feeling it was something important," she said, her voice a low, soothing melody that seemed to settle the vibration in the air. She told me she wants you to be her mom," Daniel said, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. He looked at the grass, unable to meet her gaze. "I apologize. It's a lot. She's only 9 and she doesn't understand the complexities of these things. I've probably talked about Sarah too much, or maybe I haven't talked about her enough. I don't know. I'm just trying to hold it together." Clara didn't laugh. She didn't make a joke to ease the tension. She took a step closer, invading the invisible circle of his personal space for the first time. "And what did you say to her, Daniel?" Daniel sighed, a long, shuddering sound that carried the weight of 5 years of silence. "I told her I didn't know if I was ready. I told her I was afraid of the mess. I've spent so long making sure her world is perfect that I'm terrified of letting someone in who might see that it's actually held together by duct tape and prayers. I'm afraid that if I stop being the hero, I'll just be nothing." He finally looked at her. He saw the genuine, unclouded kindness in her hazel eyes. It was a look of absolute acceptance. "I'm not ready for this, Clara," Daniel admitted, his voice cracking. "I'm not the everything Emma thinks I am. I'm just a guy who is perpetually exhausted and afraid of failing the only person left in his life. I don't know how to be a partner anymore. I've forgotten the language of us." Clara reached out, a brief, tentative touch on his forearm. Her hand was warm, grounding, and entirely real. "You don't have to be ready, Daniel. Love isn't a project you study for until you get an A. It's just being willing to be seen in the dark. It's about letting someone else hold the flashlight when your hands are full." "I'm tired of being strong," Daniel whispered, the confession spilling out before he could stop it. "Then stop," Clara said softly. "You don't have to be a fortress for me. I'm a preschool teacher. I spend my whole day around people who cry because their crackers are broken or because someone stole their favorite blue crayon. I'm very comfortable with the mess. I prefer it to the polished version anyway. The mess is where the truth lives." Daniel looked at Emma, who was watching them from the bench, giving them a small, encouraging thumbs up. He felt a surge of a feeling he hadn't felt since Sarah. Hope. It was a terrifying, electric sensation that made his heart race. "You're really not going to run away?" Daniel asked, a small, genuine smile finally touching his lips. "I'm exactly where I want to be, Daniel," Clara replied. "No scripts, no promises of forever today, just the truth. Why don't we start by getting some ice cream? I hear the CEO of your apartment is very strict about the Sunday protocols, and I'd like to submit a proposal for extra sprinkles." Daniel laughed, a real, rich sound that echoed off the trees. He realized then that he hadn't just found a mother for his daughter. He had found a partner who was willing to sit with him in the silence until the noise went away. He didn't have to be ready, he just had to be honest. And for the first time in 5 years, the frequency was perfect. 1 month later, the park looked the same. The golden sunlight was still filtering through the trees, and the children were still laughing. But the rhythm on the wooden bench had changed fundamentally. Daniel was sitting there, his arm draped casually over the backrest. He wasn't checking his watch. He wasn't reviewing a technical manual on his phone. He was just there. Beside him sat Clara. They weren't talking much, but the silence between them was no longer a vacuum. It was a conversation of its own, a shared piece that needed no translation. Emma came running from the playground, her face flushed with excitement. She didn't pull Daniel's hand this time. She ran straight to Clara and handed her a small yellow wildflower she had found in the grass. "For the teacher," Emma said with a mischievous grin. Clara took the flower, tucking it behind her ear. "Thank you, pal. It matches your jacket perfectly." Emma didn't mention the word mom anymore. She didn't have to. She realized that by speaking the wish out loud, she had broken the spell of her father's isolation. She had given them permission to move, and they were moving with a slow, careful, and remarkably beautiful grace. They were building a bridge, one plank at a time. Daniel looked at Clara, and for the first time, he didn't feel the need to look away. He saw her, not as a solution to a problem, but as a person who chose to stay in the mess with him. He realized that a family didn't have to be perfect to be complete. It didn't need a formal structure or a pre-written script. It just needed people who were willing to show up day after day and say, "I see you, and I'm not leaving." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the three of them, Daniel felt the weight of his exhaustion finally start to lift. He wasn't the everything anymore. He was just a dad, sitting in a park with a daughter he loved and a friend who made him feel like he could finally take that nap. He realized that the greatest strength wasn't in carrying the world alone, but in knowing who to ask for help when the load got too heavy. The journey wasn't over. There would still be rainy Tuesdays and burnt pancakes. There would still be ghosts in the hallway at night. But as they walked toward the car together, holding hands in a long, connected line, Daniel Brooks knew that he was no longer alone in the harbor. He was finally sailing again, into a future that wasn't perfect, but was entirely, beautifully real. True love. It isn't found in the grand gestures or the perfect timing. It's found in the courage to speak a difficult wish and the wisdom to stay until it comes true. Daniel was home, and for the first time in 5 years, he wasn't tired at all. Sometimes the most important truth is spoken by those who see the world without the filters of fear. Never underestimate the power of a child's observation. They often see the heart we've worked so hard to hide. A family is not a structure to be engineered, but a garden to be tended with patience, honesty, and the courage to let someone else hold the watering can. If you believe love can begin in the smallest, most honest moments, subscribe for more stories like this. And tell me in the comments, would you take that step into the unknown for the sake of your child's wish?